welcome to our 108th Reading Online Sport Economics Seminar. This week you have yours truly presenting, for better or worse. And so I'm presenting a presentation on away fans at football matches. I think just before I start, I guess what I will say is this is part of our autumn schedule for these talks, and next week we will have Dave Berry from the Southern Utah University presenting, and we've got a whole set of talks between now and December the 9th. I will be posting about them further on Twitter in the next few days, and you'll obviously see the list from the reminder that you got for this event recently. I shall share my screen and I'll get going. I am very happy to take questions at any point as we go along. I will be having my screen on full screen and sharing my slides. And so what that means is I won't be able to see anything, as I won't be able to see hands being raised or anything else. So please just simply feel at ease unmuting yourself and saying full screen and asking your question. Substantive clarification, all is fine. This is it's a somewhat simplistic title covering over a data set which is fairly simple in its nature, but did nonetheless take a little while to compile, just because it isn't the kind of thing that can be totally easily scraped. There's certainly some, I think there's some scope for it, possibly with the natural language processing skills beyond mine, but nonetheless, more on the nature of the data soon. But it's work that I've been doing. I've presented variants of this a couple of times in the last 6 months or so, actually 9 months or so, in physical locations, and it's work with Dominic Schreier and Carl Singleton, as well as Brad Humphreys. So there's a couple of different strands there that I'll mention as I go along. Now, next is, of course, attendance at sport events, at football matches in particular, and these kinds of attendance numbers have long been used by sport economists, since it gives us some idea of the demand for sporting events, and obviously therefore the commercial viability of particular professional sports. They're also fairly readily available historically. So here in here in England, you can get attendance data going back right to the very beginnings and earlier than the Football League's incarnation in 1888. So well over 100 years of data on people deciding that they want to go and watch a football match. It's been used, this attendance number, across different matches, geographic locations around different places, has been used as a dependent variable, often to think about the demand for sport, although it's fairly rare that price data exists to really make this what we might think about in classical terms as some kind of demand function for sport. It's also been used to think about the uncertainty of outcome hypothesis. Do we value more uncertain sporting contests more than ones that are for which the outcome is really obvious? As far as they go, it's a number. It reflects numbers of people turning up en masse for these kinds of events, but it is subject to well-known drawbacks, namely that it's capped, the stadium capacity, and also, particularly repugnant events, you wouldn't get a negative attendance, but nonetheless, it's been used for uncertainty of outcome hypothesis analysis as well. It's also been used to think a little bit about other aspects of sporting outcomes that are of interest to sporting economists. The idea of biases in outcomes towards the home team, just because they're playing in a particular setting, so the home advantage, but also kind of more broadly the idea of social pressure that people performing tasks in different social settings might act differently, and so it's reasonably well known that referees act differently under different degrees of social pressure, award more discretionary injury time at the end of football matches to teams, to the home team when they're losing with a bigger crowd, award call more fouls when they can hear the crowd versus when they can't hear the crowd, these kinds of things. Now that all of these uses, which are fascinating, I wouldn't want to anyway disparage them, they assume that fans by and large are fairly homogenous. That is, the attendance at a particular football match is all for the home team, so all the fans are backing the home team. But as is probably fairly well known, in many parts of the world, fans travel to away games, and this is particularly true here in England, which is the context for the data set that I've collected, but it's certainly true in many parts of the world as well. And given that, it means that there can be situations where away fans are a sizable proportion of the crowd, maybe even half of the crowd or a larger proportion. In which case, it's no longer the case that we can think about this social pressure exerting an influence towards the home team. Maybe it actually exerts an influence towards the away team instead. And so there's a kind of a measurement error type question to be asked, to be looked at there potentially. So to give some context, this is a picture you can't really see, but this is an idea of a football match where you've got three sides. You can't see the side down here, but you can see the where I was stood, or should have been sat, a side down here, and the side at the far, or the end at the far end there, is where away fans are allocated. So since the 1970s in England, fans have been segregated in stadiums. So prior to that, away fans would travel, but they wouldn't be put in a particular part of the stadium. Since the 1970s, they've been segregated, certainly in the Football League and the Premier League. And what, of course, that means is you can count how many away fans are going through the away turnstiles relative to the home turnstiles in principle. And this is a particular match where there was 8,000 people in attendance, of which 2,000 were away fans. And this is a stand that holds 2,300 people. So you can start to see that it's hard to see, but there's not too many empty seats. Their capacity constraint isn't being reached. An argument, or potential argument, for thinking about away fans, certainly in relation to full sets of fans in a stadium, is that there's often that bit more variation, and it's not that frequent, certainly at the lower levels of English football, of which this is a picture of. It's not that common that capacities are actually reached. So that's another aspect of thinking about away fan attendance, is that the variation isn't necessarily capped in the way that full capacity might bind for home teams, particularly towards the upper ends of the pyramid. This is another example where there's lots more empty seats, same place, but again more recently, where there was 6,600 fans in attendance, of which 92, just 92 in this 2,300 stand here were in existence. So quite a range, and there's quite a range in the data set as well. Okay, so that what this is, it's a novel data set of away attendances, counting the number of fans for the away team in the away part of the stadium at a match. It's English data. I'm very open to data for other parts of the world as well. For example, Scottish data, but I'm confident that on the continent, we have pictures last year of Frankfurt taking 30,000 fans to Barcelona. So it happens elsewhere other than just England or Great Britain, but the data is from England and a little bit of Wales so far. Fans have always travelled, as mentioned, and the size of that travelling support is a big source of pride for football fans. And so in collecting this data, I've had to trawl through many inane debates about who has the bigger set of fans and the best fans. So that's one part of the data collection process that's been a little bit yeah, distracting, I guess. And after the 1970s, segregation meant that we have an idea of who's in which part of a stadium. In more recent times, not least, I think, in response to the fact that fans care about how many of them have gone to any particular game, increasingly at football matches in England, those are the ones I've got experience of, when the attendance is announced towards the end of the game, it will also be said there was also, as in the case last weekend, 92 away fans in attendance. So given that, it also appears on social media as well. And it appears in a range of other places increasingly, which is how I've constructed the data set. I've already mentioned or hinted at the two aspects that I'm looking at. So we'll work on the uncertainty of outcome hypothesis with Brad. And if you are in Helsinki for the European Association of Sports Economists Conference in August, you will have heard him present some of that work. And then also I'm doing some work with Dominic and Carl looking at social pressure, and there'll be some hints in that direction later on in this presentation. I think there are lots of other opportunities as well, so I'll try and scope those out a little bit as we go through the data set. And in terms of those, I mean, I've already talked about home advantage and social pressure. There's a few papers there. There's obviously a lot more on home advantage than that. Excuse the blatant self-citation there. But there's obviously quite a number of papers on social pressure as well. Also, in more recent times, there's been an appreciation of the public resource impact of sport. So the papers by Stucker et al. And Alex Kadasi, Brad, and Jane and co-authors looking at flu, the impact of flu of having sports franchises. And Stucker et al. Also looked at the impact of flu of teams making the Super Bowl. This is a paper I had with Matthew Olksack and Matthew Yo, where we looked at the impact on COVID of public of football matches, mass gatherings, when we began to realise a couple of years ago that these kinds of events have the potential to spread some kind of airborne virus like COVID as it turned up. But there's more than that. You may be familiar with recent cancellations or postponements of football matches in England because there wouldn't be enough police given the state funeral for the Queen. So big matches like the one between Chelsea and Liverpool were postponed last weekend because there wouldn't be enough police resources in order to then adequately police a massive event like the state funeral. Another aspect of this receiving increasing attention is the environmental impact. This is a paper by Pam Vicker looking at the environmental impact of sports participants, but of course fans are travelling. I showed you that picture of 2,000 fans in the away end at Oldham. I mean, they only came 5 miles from Rochdale, but still, you've got lots and lots of fans travelling around the country at different points in the week, sometimes in a midweek, in and around rush hour, on a weekend, a different type of crowd. But these kinds of these amounts of fans travelling obviously create congestion problems and also have an environmental impact as well. And there must be some kind of a carbon footprint of doing so, which will be a function of how fans get from one place to another, but potentially in being able to describe a little bit more depth the nature of the impact. That might help in thinking a little bit more about it potentially. This work this presentation is basically a chapter to go into a forthcoming handbook that Placido Rodriguez is producing in memory of Stefan Kassen. So hence there's a slide on Stefan's many contributions in the literature on competitive balance, hence thinking about numbers of people wishing to attend sporting events. And Stefan looked at various aspects of the broader institutional setup of sport and how that would influence potentially people wishing to attend matches, salary caps, and other aspects in terms of how sport leagues and sports clubs organise themselves. So the data, it's come from multiple sources. There's obviously the there's obviously the fan numbers themselves, but if we're gonna think a bit about what's determining these fan numbers and controlling for other obvious explanations, and we want to investigate things like the uncertainty of outcome hypothesis, well, we need information on the matches themselves, and there are plenty of sources, but I've got results, yellow cards, fouls, and so on, and betting prices from footballdata.co.uk, as well as oddsportal.com. Footballdata.co.uk is restricted to leagues, whereas you can get a vast amount of cup and other data from oddsportal.com. Football Web Page is a website that has attendances down to quite a low level in terms of non-league football in England. Not really needed for this, given that below the National League, England's fifth tier of what's now professional football, there doesn't tend to be much segregation anymore of fans, and hence there's little reporting of that. But nonetheless, we've got information there. Worldfootball.net, another website that has lots of information on the location of football clubs and their stadiums and the capacities as well, should that be necessary. I haven't made much use of capacity information yet, but obviously have made some use of location data, as I'll show you shortly. As I mentioned, clubs announce their away and full attendances on Twitter these days, as well as at the stadium, and there are websites like this website here, fanbanter.co.uk, which collects and reports the number of away fans attending. The other source that I've got away numbers from is officially from clubs as well. So Reading Football Club, the local club to my university and my own football team, I've been able to generously access their gate books, and so the actual numbers of people in the away part of the stadium. Other people have helped me out a little bit. There's an Oldham fan who helped me collect some of the data, and then there are some really good fan websites. Wycombe Wanderers, Barnet, and Torquay United have good sources of information on away support at matches. This is just to give you an idea of what the data looks a little bit like. This is Carlisle United tweeting about the fact that there are 600 Carlisle fans. I guess that's at Sutton United, but I'm not totally sure. You can see it's hardly a massive stadium. There might be capacity constraints there, but I think that's going down to London from Carlisle, which is not a short journey. And this fan banter website lists. If you go back 3 or 4 years, it would list the highest few away attendances, and now it lists them all. And you can see telling you that there were 1,841 Sheffield Wednesday fans at Wycombe Wanderers and 1,700 Plymouth fans at Wigan. In all, these are the various numbers that we've got from various sources, and with overlap between some of the sources. We've got 6,500 matches for which we've got away attendance numbers as well as the total attendance, and therefore we can split the attendance into home and away fans. And just to give a sense of the spatial dimension of that, so I'm mentioning the geographic aspect. I'm trying to polish up on my skills at plotting maps. I've not yet got the outline map for the UK or England and Wales, as would be necessary for this particular plot. But this is a plot that gives you some idea of the kind of travel taking place. Obviously, there's a road network, so fans couldn't just simply go in a straight line between one place and another, but you can see the kinds of concentrations of football clubs. So there's the London area down here, and there's the Greater Manchester area up here, the West Midlands, Birmingham, Wolverhampton Wanderers, Aston Villa, and so on here, and a kind of a belt of clubs in Yorkshire up this side here, then the North East, Sunderland, Newcastle, Hartlepool, and so on, then down to the south coast with Brighton, Bournemouth's there, Southampton. No, sorry, Southampton's there, and the lines are thicker for the larger a crowd that's going between one place to another. And again, this is the kind of thing that's happening on a regular basis on any given on any given weekend or even midweek evening. It's worth saying, I never want to miss a chance to annoy Man United fans, but I know that in addition to away fans travelling, of course, there are some teams that have big followings from around the country, and so if Man United are playing at home, the motorways and the roads to Manchester will be clogged, not just with the away fans for whoever Man United are playing, but also all the Man United fans coming in from different parts of the UK to support United. So this is arguably well, it could be an underestimate of how much travelling is taking place. The flip side of that is, of course, is that when I attend an Oldham Athletic match down in the south of England, I'm not travelling from Oldham, which is up here. I'm travelling somewhere down in the south of England here. So there's some kind, obviously some kind of measurement error, but we still get some sense of the geographic spread of football around the UK, around England and Wales. How well spread are these observations across different football clubs? That's what this plot tells you. There are some spikes. Those spikes are not just my own team. They are Barnet. I mentioned that they had a good website. Wycombe Wanderers, a good website, and Torquay United. There's this one here as well. Reading is here. The black line is the number of home matches for which we have an observation of that team, and the red line is the number of away matches for which we have an observation of that team. So for Reading, I've got the information from the stadium manager, therefore lots and lots of Reading home matches, and not that many Reading away matches. And then other than that, there's a few other teams. That's my team there, Oldham, and a couple of others that I manually collected some of the information from Twitter. So that's Stockport, Grimsby, Mansfield Town. The final spike is, I should also mention, is Preston North End. Preston, I got information on there, the segregation and home and away fans for their matches from the National Football Museum's archive, which is at Preston North End's stadium, Deepdale. And so I've got a number of their matches as well. And in terms of the spread across competitions, very few Premier League matches, just because these are games where capacity is generally reached. Also, the Fan Banter website doesn't list Premier League away attendances, perhaps because they are all at or close to capacity. And the majority of the matches I've got come from what's called the League Two, English Football League, League Two, where over 2,000 matches. And then League One, so there's the third division. League Two is the fourth division, and then the Championship is the second division. The National League is the fifth division, and then on the right here are cup competitions: the FA Cup, the League Cup, the EFL Trophy, which is for lower division clubs, and the FA Trophy, which is for non-league teams. So a range of competitions, but mainly league matches. The overwhelming majority of games are league matches. Time-wise, they're obviously increasingly available more recently. This is a function of the websites like this Fan Banter website, but the information likely, more information likely exists back to 2010, 2009-10 via more of a trawl of Twitter, which is something that's a potential task for the future. So obviously the data is somewhat concentrated last season and recent seasons surrounding COVID, but there is a fair tail. These very early games are from Preston North End. There's a random observation from 1997, and then the rest are Wycombe Wanderers, Barnet, Reading, for which I've got either good information from the website or from the clubs themselves. And this gives you an idea of the scale of away fans relative to home fans. So the black lines, these are log scale. So I'm not giving you any information that's log scale, other than the fact that the numbers double. So log scale. So you've got attendances usually around the mid-teens, and then you've got away fans ranging up to anywhere around 2,000 and north of that. But a lot of these attendances tend to be less than 2,000. But you can see it's a non-trivial proportion, even accounting for the log scale of the crowd at a game. And this is The distribution of the ratio, where ignore the one blob at 1, that's a data error that I need to fix. But you can see that by and large, the ratio of away fans in total attendance is kind of around 5 to 10% of the total attendance, declining because obviously you get bigger shares of fans, but there are matches where the away fans take up a significant proportion of the fans in attendance. An obvious statement is that the distance that an away team has to travel will likely negatively impact the number of fans that will go. And so this is distance calculated from those coordinates that I mentioned from the World Football website, and the attendance logged, away attendance. This is, and I've plotted. It might not be obvious because there's quite a bit of noise around it. But there is a negative slope if you were to plot the line of best fit through those points, as you might expect. The further the team has to travel, the less likely it is to, the fewer fans it's likely to have in attendance. And so that's essentially the data set. It's, as I mentioned, 6,500 matches for which there's away attendance. There's a few quirks to be ironed out in terms of then subtracting the total to get the home attendance. So 10 observations there that I need to account for. And that's obviously some subset of a much larger footballing ecology, if you like, data set. Matches in league and cup since 1989 in the data set for England are just shy of 120,000 matches. So obviously we're a fairly small subset. And then what we've got also in there is I mentioned, which we're not really making use of in this presentation, but I mentioned having bookmaker odds to try and control for perceived or actual team strengths. We've got information on the actual match outcomes of those 120,000 matches. We haven't got attendance for all of them, but for the vast majority. Distances for an awful lot of those matches as well. And then we've got data on the local population. This is at the moment just a fixed number, so it's essentially a fixed effect. And so we actually drop that for the regressions that we run and just run with fixed effects for now. But there are potentially better sources, mid-year population estimates and so on, at the geographic levels that these clubs reside within. And again, that can be extracted from where they are located. And I calculate ELO strengths, but I'll come back to that in a few moments in a slide. Just before moving along, just to kind of add a little bit more on this environmental impact of football, I've put these couple of plots here. The first one doesn't need the number of away fans and doesn't rely on it. This is just simply adding up, working out the distance between teams that are playing, and then adding up the distance that teams have travelled over the years. And you can see that by and large it's increased with the league's expansion. So the league was 12 teams at first and was increasing over this period, expanding into various parts. Roger's on the call, so he'll know that this distance was smaller because the Football League was mainly northern teams. But then we had an expansion after the First World War, incorporating the Southern League and some more teams from the south. And then Football League became a full complement after the Second World War. And then we've got, this is basically the weekly distance travelled. So summing up the distances travelled of the away team in any match in any given week. And so there's obviously seasonal variation going on there. But you can see that football has been, football teams have been travelling fairly similar distances now for quite some time. The addition that we have is obviously having a little bit more of an idea of how many people are making those kinds of journeys. And so this is the data set looking at the number of fans per week travelling. Of course, there could be fans counted more than once there if they travel to 2 away games in 1 week, but this is since 2018, the number of fans travelling per week. Again, also a function of data availability, and my data obviously has been increasing over this time period, but you get some sense again of some kind of seasonality and something in the region of 40,000 fans, say on average 40 to 50,000 fans travelling any given week watching football around the country. So in terms of just presenting a few exploratory regressions, we're going to have a look at, first of all, thinking about this home and away attendance as a dependent variable, trying to explain it, perhaps do motivations for home and away fans differ in attending, and then we'll have a little bit of a look at whether away fans influence outcomes. Fans of home teams often worry that if there's a big away following, that might influence outcomes, and so obviously we can have a little bit of a look at that, at least in terms of kind of folk beliefs, that equally the potential for a social pressure type explanation. So we'll do two regression models, or two types of regression model, one with the away attendance as the left-hand side variable, one with it as the right-hand side variable. And in both regressions, we'll stick in controls. So we'll try and control for the quality of the game in terms of the team strength, which we'll use ELO ratings. And we'll use a function of ELO ratings, or the square of them, to get a sense of the balance of the game. We'll also use, I kind of put more subjective or salient, but we have information on the league table at any given point in time, and it's less likely that fans will be aware of what their team's ELO rating is, but it's much more likely they'll be aware of what league position they're in and how far from sixth position, which is a proxy for being in contention for the playoffs or promotion come the end of the season. We've also added in some variables for what I've called circumstances. The distance between the teams, already mentioned, whether or not the game took place on a holiday, be it Easter, Christmas, and weather, or New Year as well, and also mentioned already those local population figures. Quickly on the ELO ratings, for those not totally familiar, ELO ratings, an ELO rating exists for any given team at a particular point in time, or player. They're originally devised for chess. And with that ELO rating, you can, of a team, team I would have the rating R, team J, RJ. You can calculate an expected outcome from the perspective of team or player I. And if EI is 1, then player I or team I would be expected to win. If it's 0, they'd be expected to lose, and conversely for team J as well. Those strengths for each team are updated for after each match. And one of the values of the ELO system is that it allows a bigger updating if a team has won an unexpected game against a stronger team, whereas if a team has won an expected game, the increase in the rating is not quite as large. The simple measure of balance is the square, if you like, or the prediction multiplied by 1 minus the prediction from the perspective of the home team, or just multiplying the two predictions together. The expected value, or expected outcome, is bounded between 0 and 1, and when we're updating, we use an outcome variable for the actual match, which follows this, where 0 if the team loses, 1 if it wins, 0.5 if it's a draw. And we're just doing regression models, looking at the attendance on various explanatory variables. When we're looking at attendance, we've got fixed effects for home and away team seasons, so multiplying the home team by the season, the away team by the season. Also, the day of the week, midweek games tend to be less popular than weekend games, and the week of the year, because obviously the different points in the season will likely have different levels of demand. Thinking about the outcome variables, similar set of control variables and fixed effects again for these home and away team seasons, day of the week and week of the year. So far, no clustering of standard errors, so it could well be that actually these effects are more significant than they necessarily are, but we'll obviously try and consider the magnitude of the effect and the economic significance rather than simply whether or not we've got lots of stars. Those outcomes for now are looking at match outcomes in terms of the win or draw, and also the goals being scored, the goal difference for now. And as yellow cards have been a common theme, certainly in the recent literature looking at games being played without fans, ghost games, we've looked at yellow card differences as well. So looking first of all at total or at attendances and trying to explain attendances. The first column here is all of the data. And what you can see is that because we're looking at a variable that's a function of league information, we're restricted to league competitions, and so the number of observations is 61,000 for that regression. 61,000 football matches over a time period. Obviously, that's meaningful to some extent, but perhaps it's more helpful if we look still at total attendance, but we focus only on the matches to which we have those away attendance numbers. By and large, there's a small difference in the coefficients, and the standard errors get a little bit larger, but lots of effects you might expect to see are there. The distance travelled decreases attendance a little bit. If it's a public holiday of some sort, the attendance increases by 7%. There's some effect of the strength of the home team. And then we've got effects for the league positions of both teams, and a small effect of how far away from 6th is the visiting team in any kind of contention. Then these final two columns are looking at, well, what's the split? Well, splitting the crowd up into the home fans, number of home fans, and the number of away fans, and seeing whether there's differential effects of these different variables when we look at home fans and away fans separately. What we can see is that the holiday effect is much larger, as might be expected. If you've got to make a much more significant time investment traveling to a game, you're more likely to do that if it's a bank holiday weekend or if it's Christmas or Easter. And also, certainly in more recent times, the footballing authorities have often tried to organise less lengthy travel times for matches on holidays, on Good Friday and Boxing Day and so on. You can see that for away fans, the distance matters a lot more than for the home fans. So this is an increase in the distance in terms of miles, and that's a percentage decrease in the away attendance. It's a larger coefficient. What else to say? The league position matters more, of the away team matters more for obviously for the away fans. It matters for home fans and attending, so the position of the home team on home attendance, but the effect is larger for away fans. And similarly, if the away team is in, or the closer it is to contention for prizes, the more likely fans are to attend. And this is obviously a small number for closer to 6th position. And so the further down the table you are, the more you're losing fans attending the game. It's worth just noting that we do control for the week of the year. So there is a possibility that, of course, as you get towards the end of the season, the number of points from 6th increases. And so there might be a time of the year effect bundled in here, but we've tried to control for that by having fixed effects for the week of the year. So that's thinking about total attendances and the differences between home and away fans. And there's also a slight difference here in terms of the coefficient on the effect of balance. And as I mentioned, Brad presented some research looking at the uncertainty of outcome hypothesis, splitting out home fans and away fans. And that's a separate piece of work. What about thinking about match outcomes? So this table is a similar format to the last table in the sense that we're looking at all of the data in the first column, just the data for where we've got away attendances in these 3 columns, and then we split up into home and away attendance in the 3rd column, and then I add in another couple of variables in the final column for particularly large away followings. And obviously the literature, or the standard focus is on whether or not the home team wins home advantage. when we think about home crowds. But obviously, if we think about away crowds, then maybe it makes sense to ask the question, well, what's the impact of the away crowd on an away win? So think about the football match from the perspective of the away team. There's not many stars, and the effects are reasonably small here, suggesting that there isn't much of an effect of away crowds on the likelihood of an away win. There's a little bit of an effect of the strength of the teams involved, and other measures here in terms of the strength of teams involved. But there's little effect. So we've got here splitting the crowd into home and away fans. You see tiny coefficients and smaller than the standard error, so very little sign of any kind of significance. And the same is true if we try and split up into these particularly large sets of away fans travelling. The other thing to point out is that this is within home and away teams. So this is looking at the variation for a home team with the different numbers of away fans turning up, and equally for the away team with different numbers of fans travelling with them in different games. But no clear effect on the likelihood of an away win. So broadening things out a little bit, slightly unintuitive variable names, but this is the home win as the dependent variable. So 1 if there's a home win, 0 if there isn't. Outcome is draw, 1 if there's a draw, 0 if there isn't, and that's just the same column as the last table, looking at the away win. So you see no effect of home or away attendances on the away win. And still very few stars, but you can see that the home win is a little bit less likely, 0.03, with a larger away following. And in some incarnations of this, there was some sense of some significance. And equally, a possibility that there's a small effect on the likelihood of a draw. So perhaps there's an increased likelihood of a draw and a slightly lower likelihood of a home win if there are more away fans in existence. It doesn't necessarily help the away team to go as far as winning, but maybe they're more likely to get something from the game. And what you can see is that that's consistent with a small decrease in the goal difference for the greater amount of away fans in attendance. Potentially fewer goals as well if there are more away fans in attendance. So GTOT is the total number of goals in the game. GDIF is the difference. As mentioned, a common feature of the literature looking at social pressure has been to look at yellow cards, with the argument being this is potentially a referee mechanism. And so we've included the difference between the home yellow cards and away yellow cards, and there's no significant effect there. But that is because that potentially masks what's going on for home and away yellow cards separately, which I'll move on to now. So this is looking in a bit more depth at yellow cards. So yellow cards for the home team, yellow cards for the away team, the difference between them, which is the same as the final column on the last slide, and the total number of yellow cards in a game. And what you can see here is that there appears to be an increase in the number of yellow cards given to home players if there are more away fans in attendance. And so that's this is the dependent variable is the number of yellow cards, and this is the log of away attendance. So I'm not going to try on the fly interpret that, but in terms of the magnitude of other coefficients, that's reasonably sizable. And also there's a smaller effect, but still reasonably sizable, of the total number of away fans on the number of away yellow cards as well. There's a larger but insignificant, estimated with more noise, effect on the number of away yellow cards of the home attendance, which is arguably the kind of the counterpart of the social pressure argument. But you can see that simply having more away fans in attendance increases the total number of cards, perhaps reflecting that there's more noise. Therefore, the referee might hear away fans shouting for a foul when a foul occurs, which they wouldn't do if there was a small number of away fans in attendance, controlling for the tense, how close the match is, and strengths of the teams involved in the match. So there's basically some kind of an effect there when we're looking at yellow cards, in the sense that there are more yellow cards when there are more visiting fans in attendance. And of course, this is more visiting fans in attendance conditional on the number of home fans in attendance. It might be that a different functional form, a more useful functional form, might involve the ratio that I plotted earlier on. These are potential further explorations in time. So that's just a summary of what I've just talked about in terms of different effects motivating away fans to attend. Little effect on most of the main outcomes, but there appears to be an effect such that more away fans in the game is consistent with more yellow cards for both teams, conditional on, well, conditioning as best we can on other characteristics of the game. So to wrap up, it's a large data set that disaggregates football attendees into partisan groupings for the home team and for the away team. And there's potential use across a wide range of topics, subject to obviously all the usual limitations with using attendance data, but the potential for measurement error and censoring and so on. It's been exploratory work so far, with the work with Brad suggesting that fans are motivated, away fans are motivated by the uncertainty of outcome hypothesis, although home fans have a home win preference, which might not be entirely surprising, but at least it's nice to be able to show that using data. And then what I presented here kind of feeds into the work I'm doing with Carl and Dominic on the social pressure aspect. I think there are other uses of the data. I mentioned the kind of the environmental or the public health or public resource aspect. I think that's something that may be interesting to pursue. And there's may well be other applications I haven't necessarily thought of, so I'm happy to discuss anyone who's particularly interested in the data set. And I shall stop there and invite any questions and comments that people have.
I have a couple of questions.
Go on, Pete.
Could you rerun those regressions at the end with the percent of the away team as of the total? It might just be easier to interpret than the logs.
Yeah.
And also, do you have capacity?
Yeah.
Of the stadiums? You could maybe then look at how filled the stadiums are, if that makes a difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I figure there might be more yellow cards if there's more excitement in a fuller stadium. But yeah, I think you have a really interesting data set. Thanks.
Thanks, Pete. Any other questions and comments? Bennett's got in the chat, Frankfurt case, good example of away fans not only buying tickets for the away stands, but also general stands. Yeah, that's a good point, Benedict. We only have here what's officially counted as the number of away fans, which often you find people are unsure about. So Carl and I went to a game the other week, and we were a little bit skeptical of both the number of the overall attendance and the number of the away fans in attendance, but then we weren't doing the official count. But thanks for that, Benedict. Alex, put your hand up.
Thank you for a very nice presentation. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I don't see. Okay. So can you go to this results of the relationship between distance and the attendance of the away teams?
You mean in terms of the the plot or the
where the dependent variable is the attendance of the away team.
Yeah, yep, there you go.
And you have a significant relationship between distance and log. So this means that, so actually you find a significant relationship between distance and attendance, meaning that distance affects attendance of the away team, right?
Yep.
And then in the next table, where you take into account the results, you have both distance and away attendance together.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure whether it seems like a standard bet control thing, right?
Say again, sorry?
So I think it's the usual bet control thing. So maybe you should remove this.
Probably should, to be honest. It's not. I mean, there's a thought that the further you travel, you know, home advantage kind of argument, but I mean, it doesn't look like it's having much of an effect. But yeah, I think that's a fair point. And it's obviously not a huge effect, but you're right, it's certainly correlated, and so worth thinking about whether that should be there. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah.
Sorry, I missed that. Was that something else, Alex? Or
No, I just forgot to.
okay, no worries. Any other questions and comments? Stefan.
Well, if the microphone's still working or you haven't managed to mute it.
Not silencing you.
So no, I think this is really interesting because we haven't seen this kind of data before, so it's really interesting to see this kind of thing coming out. So but I do think this issue of obviously the official numbers and what is an away fan is a real issue. I remember I once took my kids when they were small to watch Scunthorpe play Chelsea in the FA Cup, and we scored first. But I had to make sure my kids stayed very quiet because we weren't in the Scunthorpe end, and we certainly didn't want to antagonize the Chelsea fans surrounding us. So that was a very strange event. But what strikes me is that an interesting dimension of this relates to crowd trouble. And it strikes me you could probably do some work here if you were using Twitter data. It seems to me, official statistics on crowd trouble are probably quite hard to get across all of these games, but you could look at something like Twitter and find any mentions of any incidents around the games, which might then, firstly, it might give you some sense of the presence of away fans. And secondly, might also then feed into some of these issues about whether the crowd is having an effect, because, if there's crowd trouble, then or fan trouble going into the game, then you might think that would be likely to have an outsized effect on what actually happens on the pitch.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Stefan. I mean, there is this data set because there was a BBC article this week about it's been released for the crime statistics for football for the year, and it's the highest it's been in 14 years or something. It's not done by game, but it does break down the number of banning offences by team. So Everton was quite high, I think, because of their large pitch invasion at the end of the season. But yeah, I think that's a really good thought actually in terms of mixing that together with the potential for unrest. Thanks, Stefan. And then Gurgley has his hand up.
Hi, James. It was a really nice presentation. I really liked it. I just thinking about that the rivalry is missing from. It's difficult to measure between teams, but yes, it's rivalry is more important. These control variables, and I don't know that how to create for so many games a rivalry variable, but it will be interesting that what we see about the attendance.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's something that I was thinking about a little bit in relation to the distance. Obviously, you imagine that rivals would have a small distance But then equally, you might imagine, therefore, that the distance effect is non-linear. A way in which I've done that in other work is I've been able to merge in the nuts regions. So obviously you have nuts level 1, 2, and 3, and level 3 obviously is quite small geographic areas. And if you have more than one team in that area, you might class them as rivals. But then, of course, that wouldn't count. That wouldn't allow you to look at Man United and Liverpool, for example, as rivals. But yeah, the point's well taken that there are rivalries in there, and traditional rivalries that may lead to particular patterns in attendance. So thank you for that. And Roger. Can't hear you, Roger. I can see that you're talking, but I can't hear you. Could hear you early on, Roger, but can't hear you now. I don't know what's changed with your settings. You're not on mute, so I don't know if your microphone's not plugged in. I think Benedict put in the chat as well. Then yellow cards, away fans relationship. Couldn't it be just the case that more away fans are attracted to more controversial matches such as derbies? Then the yellow cards are not caused by the away fans, but ultimately the exogenous heat of the match itself. I think so, Benedict, and that's entirely feasible. We obviously have a measure in there of how tight the match is in terms of this balance measure, which is its maximum at 0.5. So the more equal the match is, that doesn't necessarily count for it being a tense rivalry, but we do have the distance as well. But it's absolutely a point that it isn't necessarily simply the number of fans. It could also be the proportion of the fans. So in that model so far, it's just the two numbers of fans, whereas it might be the ratio that actually matters more. Or as one comment made earlier on, it could be relative to the capacity of the stadium as well. If it's a tight stadium and it's quite close to being full, relative to being a cavernous stadium and not all that full at all, really. So absolutely interesting point. Thank you, Benedict. I guess Roger has decided not to try and struggle on.
No. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
All right, brilliant. Okay. Techno wizard. Yes. I missed the finale because there was a power cut here, which has obviously done something else to the thing. But I'd just like to make a couple of points about the football authorities making your data impure, in that away capacities are manipulated by football clubs. So Reading's away capacity has been cut in half from its situation 3 or 4 years ago. The other way in which your data is being manipulated by the football authorities is the policy of making more games that are more attractive to away fans take place at weekends and not during weekdays, which does cause the loyalist supporter who wants to travel from Cheltenham to Sunderland on a Tuesday night and back a great deal of problems. But this is outweighed by the football clubs thinking they'll make more money from the larger crowds that will attend at weekends. And I do apologise if I missed anybody else making that point while I was power cut out.
I don't think anyone did, Roger, but thank you for the point on Reading's capacity being cut in half, because one of the conversations I had with the stadium manager there was this kind of thought about whether cutting the capacity in half from 4,000 to 2,000 had any difference on outcomes. It was done, I believe, because there was concern about Leeds bringing endless thousands of fans down and influencing outcomes. But I mean, at least from looking at this, it appears that all that might have had an effect on is maybe it increased the number of yellow cards. It's not clear it had any notable effect on outcomes, but that's just kind of I guess tentative conclusions. You're very right on the scheduling effect. it obviously has an effect on travelling, because obviously I guess if you want to discourage travelling to those long games, maybe you organise all those long trips, Scunthorpe to Sunderland on a Tuesday night rather than on a Saturday. But yeah, some of those, that kind of holidays, size of that holidays coefficient is possibly larger because the authorities now organise local-ish games on Boxing Day, whereas they wouldn't have done perhaps 15, 20 years ago. So absolutely, the scheduling is something that means that the sample isn't random. It's something that does need to be given additional thought to. So thank you for both of your thoughts, Roger. Jorge has his hand up. You're still on mute, Jorge. I can't turn you off mute. Guess we've all got out of, you're going to write it down. Okay, I guess we all got out of practice of using Teams, and so we're not able to use it. Got back into in-person meetings again, which is good. Okay, so I'll wait for you to type it out, Jorge. Of course, if anyone else has any questions and comments. There we go, got it, Jorge, thank you. Missed the presentation, but it might matter the percentage of away fans relative to home fans. I understand in Champions League, I understand there's a regulation 5%. In South America, away teams can have even 80% of the stadium. Yeah, I've not used that, Jorge, as a dependent variable as yet. So in all these regressions, it's just home and away attendance, or as the dependent variable or independent variable. But we do have that. Obviously, we can calculate that ratio. This is what you've got across our data set. So the vast majority of games, there's kind of 5 to 10% of the stadium as away fans. But there's a significant proportion of games where that's larger. I've been to games where it's kind of 40, 50% of the crowd is away fans. And so that might matter. Not yet looked at, experimented sufficiently far with the specifications, but that's certainly on the radar to do. There's another thought, of course, is that it's probably well known to clubs how many of their fans are going to turn up to any given match. Always it's this game against Salford or whoever. Therefore, we know that X hundred of our fans will always turn up, and suddenly loads more turn up, or suddenly loads fewer turn up. So there's potentially also some aspect of unexpected differences in different parts of the crowd, perhaps, and how they might have an effect. But yeah, the ratio is certainly an important consideration. So thank you for that. Any final questions and comments people have? In which case, I will stop sharing. Now, I'll just quickly share the schedule for the coming few weeks. Obviously, we'll be back next week. Next week, we have Dave Berry presenting Gender Bias and Perceived Quality. Then we'll have Gurgley, who was a question earlier on, Uncertainty of Luck and Explainability in the Results of Olympic Sports. Sandro Heiniger, General Framework to Quantify the Event Importance, Multi-Event Contest. Johannes Kassinger, shrouding the incidence of sin taxes in online betting markets. Then a break, half term here in the UK for schools. Thomas Warren on November the 4th, a relationship between financial and sporting performance of professional football clubs. Jean-Louis Fury looking at a timely moment about the FIFA World Cup, because I think the World Cup starts around about then. Pete Buthuis will present in November the 18th, positional segregation, career length in Major League Baseball. Marcus Dirtvingel-Karlt, skewness preference, evidence from online poker. Again, 2 talks on poker in the coming weeks. And then finally, 2 more talks after that. Christian Ruzier, making a Maradona, meat consumption, soccer prowess. And finally, before we wrap up for Christmas, Brian Mills from the University of Texas, racially congruent leadership and firm performance. So a very interesting set of talks ahead. So please do continue to join us. In the meantime, I wish you all a fantastic weekend. See you all soon.